everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. It's Sally here, and I'm delighted to introduce a very special recording for you today. In May, James was lucky enough to interview Professor Sapatha Dasgupta, Frank Ramsey, Professor Emeritus of Economics and Fellow of St John's College, both at the University of Cambridge. Professor Dasgupta's research interests have covered welfare and development economics, the economics of technological change, population, environmental and resource economics, the theory of games, the economics of undernutrition, and the economics of social capital. Most recently, of course, he published The Economics of Biodiversity, a global independent review commissioned by the UK Treasury. And that's the topic that they discussed in this interview. So without further ado, we'll get straight into it.
Professor, we are absolutely delighted to have you here today and really look forward to hearing from you. So perhaps we'll jump straight into your review, which makes the argument that nature is an asset, that we are not external to nature, but rather we are embedded within nature. Could you expand on that framework and what you were getting at?
Yes, of course. And let me first begin by saying it's a pleasure to be here and to meet you. Yes, I think we often make a mistake of thinking of nature as a whole, because we immediately think, well, that's something else that's out there. It's precious, it's pivotal, it's everything. It's easier to think of the components of nature, and I'm thinking of ecosystems, if you like. That's how the review could be grassland, it could be a patch of your back garden, it could be a garden pond, it could be the open oceans. These are all assets in the sense that they're durable. So they're durable goods are assets, and they're fundamental to our life. We wouldn't exist. We are part of it, nature. We are embedded in nature, and that makes it distinct. That's distinct from the way we typically think of nature in economics, not because we economists are not human. It's just that it's common practice to think of the biosphere or the nature as something on which we can draw for our purposes and then send back like a fisherman does with fishing, takes fish out, and then the residue goes back. Being embedded really means that it's like our home. The human economy is embedded inside a structure, superstructure, which is our home. Includes all those things inside it as well. So yes, it's an asset. It's our largest asset. And we economists tend often to think in terms of produced assets, like roads and buildings, or human assets, capital, education, and health. And the part of economics, which I think the review really makes connection with and tries to extend, is growth and development economics. So it looks in the long term. And I think ignoring nature as an asset is a mistake of a fundamental order.
And so I think to then extend that a bit further, it's about thinking about, well, the inherent value of the biosphere, of living things, of the planet, I suppose, of the natural world. So how do we start thinking about and putting into practice this perception of the natural world having value, rather than, I think, heard you and Mark Carney and others talk about, it's a tragedy that the value of the rainforest is more in log form than it is as a living, thriving rainforest. And how do we turn that corner and change that?
Right. It's a very good question. But it does have an answer, and a good one. So I'm going to try and give it to you, which is that this gigantic asset, we should think of nature as a mosaic of interconnected ecosystems. Okay, and that's a loose expression, ecosystem. It could be a pond, it could be a lake, it could be a rainforest. They're all ecosystems. They're providing services, they're producing goods. It's like a gigantic set of factories churning out goods and services all the time. One of which is, of course, climate regulation. The fact that we have evolved, humanity has evolved in a fairly stable climate, particularly now, last 10,000 years or so. Our economic evolution has been really in a stable climate system. But there are many other things. There's nitrogen fixation. There's pollination that takes place even if we were not here. There's natural cleaning of the water through wetlands, clean waters, soil regeneration. All sorts of things are happening. And we are dependent on them. Some simply to be able to breathe, and others for being able to produce goods and services like food, material for our homes, clothes, and so forth. Okay? So we are drawing on nature all the time. And when we talk about the value of nature, we don't mean pricing the whole of the biosphere. We don't mean that at all. That's nonsensical because it doesn't mean anything. Because you put a price tag on it, it presumably means that you intend to exchange it for something else. But we won't be here if we can't, if it's not there. So that's not it. That's not the point. The point is to see the functional value as a start, the functional value of any ecosystem. Say a piece of agricultural land. So a farmer there's a price for land, for agricultural land in England, in a particular locality of Cambridge, for example. He or she could sell the land at some price. Now, whether the price is right in the sense that it reflects the productivity of the land and what it contributes to the rest of the ecosystem, that's a different matter. And the wedge between what it is priced at in the market and its true value in some sense, that wedge is the reason, the existence of that wedge is the reason I wrote the review of the Economics of Biodiversity. So the problems arise that much of nature, much of the characteristics of these assets are invisible and silent. So that's two features of nature which make them very different from commodities like chairs and tables. Okay. And it's third, which is very well understood, recognized by economists, is that nature is mobile. So which means property rights are hard to establish. Okay? Because you can't grab hold of it like you can on a table, it's sitting in front of you. It's not going to move, right? You can establish property rights to it. So that makes a huge difference to the valuation of these assets in the marketplace. And when I say market, I don't mean only markets in the vulgar sense. I mean general institutions, okay, now daily interchanges. And typically it's undervalued because of the fact that nobody owns it. So we inflict too much pressure on it. We overuse it because it's cheap. That's the idea.
And so I suppose when something is undervalued, the approach to dealing with that, perhaps from a policymaker perspective, is to try and incorporate the value of that in some way into its price, and perhaps an arbitrary way. And we've seen that with things like carbon pricing and cap and trade schemes and things. Is that an approach that can be taken, like really, really understanding and incorporating into prices somewhere the value of either those ecosystem services? Although I agree with what you say, that this is not just about what is the value of that ecosystem to us. It's about what is the value of that ecosystem to the planet as a whole. But thinking about then perhaps rather than just trying to measure what is the value of bees to a farmer being able to have their crops pollinated versus how do we price in the externalities of that asset and therefore not damaging that asset because it's recognized as having a value? Is that something that we need to really get to grips with as a world, as a community?
That's exactly right. You've put your finger on it, on the externalities. So you want to measure the gap between its value and what it commands in our daily life, in the marketplace, as it were. So that's a very, very important thing. And there are ways of trying to tease out estimate these gaps. You can be successful in some, you can't in others. But I want to elaborate a little bit on this notion of pricing, because we are led to think of, we're drawn to the idea of, say, taxation for external diseconomies. So pollution tax, for example, or carbon tax. the economics of biodiversity is a lot more difficult than the economics of climate change. And Lord knows the economics of climate change is difficult itself. It's the science of climate change is extremely difficult. And of course, the science of biodiversity is even more difficult because it's not only climate, but many other things, all the things that we enumerated before. The economics is a lot harder because there is no single metric. You see, the economics of climate change has been reduced to a single metric, carbon emissions or carbon concentration. And the only reason for that is that carbon concentration leads to a climate system, and often regarded, interpreted in terms of a single metric like mean global temperature. And then you work back from that to see how that will affect the rest of our economy, say agricultural production, level of sea level, and so forth. And then we look for the damages. So tracing back, you work through the carbon emissions, and then you say, well, what's the social cost of carbon? Now, the community of nations haven't actually gone through that route because there's no world government imposing a tax on carbon emissions. What they've done instead is to slice up, and each country makes a commitment to how much it will reduce its carbon. Then each country on its own can work out what taxation is required in order to support that ambition. Okay, so that's the way it's, as far as I can understand, the argument has gone. But my review doesn't say anything about biomass pricing. It's not based on biomass, for the reason that biomass is not a well-defined concept. Its role in an ecosystem depends on the ecosystem it happens to be in. So a unit of biomass in the tropics, in a tropical rainforest, would be very different from a unit of biomass. Its contribution to the ecosystem would be very different from its contribution in the oceans, for example. So you can't have biomass offsetting markets either, because you can, some broker will make a killing, by the way, by destroying biomass here and planting the equivalent biomass somewhere else. I mean, and then you'll need more institutions to be able to block that. So what do? We do what's much more natural for the economist. Think of nature as a productive factor. Now look for its productivity. When I say nature, of course, now I'm always using nature as a stopgap for an ecosystem. So you ask yourself, what's the productivity of this wetland? Let us say, if it's a wetland you're thinking of. And then you ask what kinds of goods and services it is offering us. Well, it's a home for bees, so come back to your pollination. So therefore, it helps. Neighboring farms are benefiting from the fact that the bees go and pollinate. What else does it do? Well, among other things, it filters water. All right, can we try and measure that? Well, one quick way would be to say, well, suppose it didn't, then how would we get clean water? Maybe a filtration plant. How much does that cost? So you can see how I'm heading. So you're trying to tease out the function, if you like, the contribution it makes to our economies in terms of production. So that's one way of doing it. But that must be a minimal amount. And I'll come to that because others will say, well, look, the wetlands more than just a factor of production. It's something wonderful out there. There's life there. All right. And you go, in fact, people go and walk there. What about that? Well, okay. You then say, let's add a value to it and try and see what it's worth to us as an amenity value. Okay. That we can go and enjoy it and so forth. And there are techniques for doing that as well. I won't go into this, definitely, but you can appreciate that it's a different kind of value and you want to add to it because it's in a sense that factor is giving, this wetland is giving you a joint product. It's not only a means to our production, but it's also giving us pleasure, direct pleasure. Then somebody said, no, even that's not enough. There's life in there. That has a value, intrinsic value. All right. And there's a unique bird life out there. And if that wetland is destroyed, that population will be wiped out. And then somebody says, it's not even that. It's more than that. There is a tribe which actually regards this as sacred. So you see, you can add layers of value. Now, of course, once you recognize that, you know which direction you want to head. But quantifying that's going to be impossible. Right? If it's a sacred value, effectively, what do you mean? I mean, it's almost like saying it's got infinite value. Nothing, it can't be touched. And in some cases, we don't touch it. We have legislation. This is sacred, it can't be touched. So that's like an infinite value. Now, in the review, I allude to all this, but I stop short of it for the reason that you need to note it, but you can't do very much with it after having noted it. But here's the thing. If you do these kinds of calculation, this kind of analysis with a very biased value, it gives you a lower bound to the value because you're only looking at it as a means for the economy, not as an end in itself, the wetland. And if you then find that the wetland is worth preserving because it's doing a lot for us, then wouldn't you be wanting to preserve it even more firmly if you added further values? So there are advantages of looking at the problem with a biased set of estimates. And that's what the review does for the most part, because it shows that we really are in trouble. Humanity really needs to work very hard now and quickly to stem the biodiversity loss. And it does so without even thinking about sacredness, without thinking about all the higher things, but simply that our economies will collapse if we destroy it.
From a very much of a kind of existential approach, which I think is perhaps one of the most alarming things about your review is the extent to which we are living beyond our planetary means. I think you quote 1.6 times our planetary boundaries, and clearly that's going to be very hard to reverse. And I think so from where we're standing as UCSIF, we've got members who are part of the financial community of the UK who are really keen to make change, who are keen to play their part in providing the world we want to see for future generations, which I know from reading your work is very much something that motivates you. Is what should our members, the financial community, be doing today? What are the things that we can do as a financial community? And on some levels, perhaps this is touching a little bit on what do we need to prioritize. I think we published a policy vision a few weeks ago, and one of the challenges we had developing the biodiversity chapter for the policy division, the policy paper was even just an understanding of what things should be top of the list of things that we preserve. Is it soil preservation? Is it rainforests? Is it the oceans? Of course, it's all of these. And yet, it's perhaps can be broken down. Where should the priorities lie, and what perhaps two separate different questions. Where should the priorities lie, and perhaps what can the financial services industry do in this sense?
Very impossible question to answer in some level, but I think I have to respond obviously to your question. I'm not sure that the question is well directed, because the answer depends a lot on who it is who is asking. And you are asking regarding the financial services. But the question is, what are you financing? Which kind of companies are you looking at? I mean, you can take a very broad classification of extractive industries and industries which produce using primary product. Take just those two examples. Now, there's a conflict between the two in some deep sense, because the extractive industries, almost by definition, are going to be destroying biodiversity. Whereas, say, a producer of products which require primary goods from, say, the tropics would be particularly interested in conserving the source of the supply chain, which would mean some form of conservation project. So the motivation is different there. On the other hand, CEO of a company which is an extractive company, let us say, is still nevertheless a human being. He or she is likely to be a father, possibly even a grandfather or mother. So there's a conflict there. If you want to go by strict profit motive, and about the surrounding landscape comes for free, then you wouldn't care. It's not part of your calculation, but you worry about it. Have sleepless nights. What am I doing? Well, one way of handling that is, in some sense, joining force with other companies and encouraging legislation, which will make you pay for it. Now, that sounds very odd that so that I'll leave that extractive industry for the moment aside. I'll come back to it in a minute, but look at the other case. Let's say you produce coffee and you source their coffee beans down somewhere in Africa or wherever, whatever the source is. Okay. And you've got a long supply chain and you're worried. You're a CEO. You're not a parent at this stage, at this point, and you worry about your supply. Because if that area gets destroyed, the biodiversity is lost there, the quality of your supply will be hampered. So you need to protect that supply. The main thing here is the protection of that supply now does involve you to engage with the local community, with the government there, to ensure that there's not just fair practice, that's the minimal, it's more safe practice, preservation. And the governments in poor countries are not necessarily benign over their own citizens. We have plenty of examples of that. So you need to engage on that front as well. And then, of course, there's this whole entire sequence, the supply chain, until the product is sold. Now, as it happens, these days, citizens have demanded that you disclose. The company discloses the features of the product. Fair trade is one, because we care about that. That's on income inequality and so forth. But if the ecologically minded person would actually be also interested in the state of the source of the supply. What's the ecosystem like? Is it degrading? That kind of information. And what are you doing about it? So I think one of the things that the firms can do is actually tying their hands would be like saying, make it compulsory that we disclose. Make it because that will tie our hand, but in the end, it's going to reduce a lot of our uncertainty about future production. Okay. And of course, there's also uncertainty about what consumer fads and fashions turn out to be. If today we care a lot about our own personal health, and that's why food products have a huge amount of information given to us about what they contain, sugar, salt, you name it, fat, and so forth. Okay. But suppose in 10, 15 years' time, we all become naturalists and start insisting that firms have to disclose what's going on. Then wouldn't it be better if you had done it before and gained an advantage over your rivals and being a good guy? So either way, first mover advantage is there, or the uncertainty about which way consume. Seems to me that's one thing you can do. It seems a rather odd kind of recommendation that you join forces to tie your own hands, but tying one's own hands can give you collective benefits of a kind that untied hands won't. And of course, theory of externalities is precisely where that truth looms large. Game theory and the whole lot of these reasonings are telling you that we should voluntarily urge us to give up because unilaterally we wouldn't have that kind of incentive, obviously, because there's a risk of doing something which others aren't doing. So that's one way of going it. In other words, disclosing the character of our production structure right from the word go, from the source to the sink. To the marketplace, rather, is a substitute for the fact that many markets are missing. It really is a substitute. If the markets were there and they were working well, and the prices were reflecting social costs, then of course there would be no need for disclosure, because you're paying the fair price for everything that you've bought in order to produce your. Okay, extractive industries is somewhat different. There is a tension. There's a huge tension between the activities involved in extraction from the activities involved in using material from the world, which is naturally growing material, and then using it for. So I'd like to make that distinction.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. And I think, just on the disclosure point, you've touched a little bit perhaps on the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, something that ArcSIF supports. We're very keen to see the development of that. Where do you see that going, and how do you see that operating, and what impact do you think that might have in future?
I think it has a huge scope. It's a very encouraging thing in my judgment. I mean, obviously it is. It needs to go a lot farther. You see, we have essentially up to now concentrated on fairness of trade because we care about income distribution and how people are treated. And this one is really concerned with how nature is treated in the process. And it requires equal attention. Because ultimately, if nature goes down, we go down. It's not just a question of being, religious. This is not an aesthetic or religious point of view. It's really I'm really using it. I think it's useful to keep to the bare bones and think of the biospheres or the ecosystems as factors of production.
Right. Yeah.
That will get us a long way towards rescuing ourselves from the plight we are in.
Absolutely. And then, so in terms of coming on to the recommendations that you've made, there's a series of recommendations for the financial community, and that's the audience that we have here today. And so what would be your core recommendations to the sustainable finance community in the UK? Now, of course, I say sustainable finance community because we believe that doing something that has no future is not sustainable. That we want to do things that can be sustainable into the future. And so, living out beyond our planetary boundaries or natural boundaries is not sustainable because it cannot continue indefinitely. So what can the sustainable finance community that's interested in changing to thinking about how we can invest and finance things differently? What are your recommendations for this industry?
Good. Well, obviously, not being a market manager, I'm speaking as a professor, not as I can think of the conceptual moves that need to be made. One big one, which is very much a major recommendation of the review, is that in some sense governments need to prepare their accounts of the economy in the way companies do by creating balance sheets. By that I mean stocks, information about the stocks, because it's stocks of assets that we hand over to our children, our grandchildren, and so forth. So that's what's carried over. And we began by recognizing that natural capital, if you like, let's call it that, these are assets. The wetlands and so forth, these are assets. So for long-term sustainability of the financial sector, it's important that the signals that you receive from the government as well as from the marketplace are consistent with sustainability. And they are not, because governments do not give you information about stocks. They give you information about flows, like income and expenditure, GDP. Now, you don't use GDP. It's misleading to think that GDP guides a company's decisions, except insofar as predicting what demand is likely to be in the future. When you decide whether or not to invest, you use hard-headed analysis like rate of return or net present value of a project. Okay, whether it's an extractive industry or whether it's somebody that produces goods, whatever. Any production, any investment project is to be evaluated using standard techniques of cost-benefit analysis. It could be, let's just say, for the sake of argument, call it net present value, because that's the right one. And rate of return is just another way of expressing it. Okay, net present value. The problem is, but what does net present value measure? It measures it's the discounted value of the flow of net benefits, right? So you're adding a weighted sum of net benefits into the future. Net benefits are net profits in your case, in the case of the company. Okay, I was thinking of a government project. They won't call it profit. They'll be calling it social profit or net benefit. Let's say private company. Okay, so it's a net profit. But then each year's net profit projection of the project is a flow. Okay, so you're summing them over time to get the net present value. So the sum of the flows is a stock. So net present value calculation is giving you an indication of the change to the wealth of the company if the company were to invest in that particular project. The change in the wealth. The problem is that the wealth calculation is wrong from the social point of view because many of these natural capital, which may be inputs in production, have a zero price. So you're not costing it. So that's where the error comes, right? So if you're really keen on preserving natural capital down in let's say, down in Ghana, from where you're getting the coffee beans, I'm still thinking of that kind of a chain. The project has that. Remember, the input has the coffee beans in it too, each year's recurring cost. Okay. Now, if that ecosystem is declining, you need to know that, because that's going to influence your estimate of the costs of the net benefits of the project. So we need to move our attention away from flows to stocks, which is how we began this conversation, because we began with thinking of nature as an asset. So the move from flows to stocks is the key change I would recommend in economic thinking. Now, firms do that. You have a company will have an inventory of the furniture it has, the factories owns, and so forth. Goes without saying. Governments don't do that. Most governments will not be able to tell you. They'll be able to tell you now about forest cover because it's easy to get that information from satellite data of the cover. But if you ask them what is the composition of the forests, most government, certainly the finance ministry, wouldn't have the faintest idea what you're talking about. That's a terrible thing because you really need to have stocks. So for governments, the recommendation is that we should move to a system of wealth accounts, which includes natural capital. And that should complement national, GDP accounts, obviously, income and expenditure accounts. And the key role for the private sector would be here to align itself with government policy, the government estimates, so that they don't go in different directions. If they do, that's where we get into trouble, because then there's misallocation of resources, which everybody pays for. Now, I don't know if it's not a simple answer, and it's probably a rather umbrella-like answer to your question. But it had to be that because, what one company should do will be different from what another company would do, and I wouldn't be able to give you any sensible answer to that because I'm ignorant. But certainly a change in the perception of what an economic environment is needed. And the economic environment, that change really needs to take nature absolutely as an essential core factor of production.
And I quite like that concept of considering the true wealth of, particularly a government considering the true wealth of what they have. And actually you can extend that to all sorts of other things, the value of clean air, in terms of the air that we breathe, and the value of a park, or as opposed to housing developments, and so it's actually potentially a model that's highly scalable to any number of different areas, and it could actually prove quite useful for all sorts of policy making.
Absolutely, quite right. And the moment you said value of clean air, and somebody might rightly say, look, you can't value all of these things. Many of them are so intangible objects, very difficult. We addressed that right at the beginning of this discussion that we've had anyway. Well, if there is too much of a dispute about the value, which there can be, depending on personal interests, by the way, I mean, if we've seen this only 15 years ago, a lot of companies were claiming that there was nothing called climate change happening through anthropocentric reasons. Okay, so they could, so even you couldn't get to square, base one with that. Then the right thing is to be commonsensical and say, all right, we won't place a value, but what we will do is to describe the stock. And we'll ask, is this year's stock in a more degraded state than last year's stock? And we'll make a note of that in our inventory. This has gone down in quality. Say air quality has deteriorated. Instead of saying, oh, it's eating up 2% of our GDP. That's where the disputes come up. And I think that's very often unhelpful. It's better to be just clear as to the description of an asset can buy you a lot of mileage. Because people can get a feel. Oh my gosh, you mean that much of sulfur content, sulfur dioxide quality. That's sort of frightening, So there's, one doesn't have to always think in terms of a scalar index. Having valued everything, you then add them all up and say, here is the wealth of our nation. That may be sort of a platonic goal, but it's a false goal. We shouldn't go in that direction. What we're really after is valuing our assets. And get a sense of our portfolio of assets that we have inherited and what we're receiving at the end of the year. Let's see if it's an annual accounting system. Some have gone up, some have gone down. There are more roads, but there is a deteriorating wetland or coastal region or something.
And I think
that description is needed.
It's that balancing as well that hasn't historically happened. It's a case of more roads equals better without thinking about, well, what is the balancing factor on the other side? Exactly. And I think so as you say, without even necessarily quantifying in numerical value terms, it allows you to create a value proposition of, is this development worth the impact that it will have? And I think that's perhaps where we don't cognitively go at the moment.
We don't do that, and we should. And particularly now, given the fact that slight deteriorations can lead to big payments. That's we have these expressions like tipping points, thresholds, and so forth. And these do have meaning, formal meaning. And so in the case of climate change, it's good, since we know something about it, we've been talking about it for quite some years now. So when there's an idea that you limit it to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level, the mean climate temperature. What does that amount to? Somebody says not 1.5, 1.6. Why not 1.6? Why 1.5? Well, of course, the choice is a pragmatic one. But the thought here is really that when you get to about 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, the danger lurks, serious danger lurks out there. We are going beyond the band with which we can accommodate, given our infrastructure, given our past history, given our evolutionary history, and so forth. Okay, and it may be that we can manage on 1.8. We don't know. In fact, we are certainly heading in that direction. But the point about it is that the existence of these tipping points, potential tipping points, whose location we don't quite know, alerts us to the idea that maybe we have driven even our local ecosystems to the point where it'll flip. And so quality information is extremely important. Ecologists are doing it all the time. They're saying this looks like a very unhealthy patch in this forest. Look at the flora, quality of the flora, and so forth. There are many, many ways of trying to tease out the health of an ecosystem. And so we need, to come back, description of the assets is extremely important. Description of your own home.
Yeah, of course. And I think that data piece is going to become increasingly important. We know that the data in terms of climate related data has improved dramatically, and things like TCFD and companies reporting is only going to add to that. And so it feels like we need to take a similar approach to data that we've done with climate data to nature and biodiversity related data as well. So perhaps that's something that an industry that needs to really start moving forward.
I have actually seen reports of that, of companies worrying about sort of seemingly unrelated disappearance of species, of certain types of birds, because some ecologists in their company maybe have said that, look, that's a symptom of lack of food for the bird, and what food does it have? And then you trace it back, and then you come to a conclusion that there's something going wrong in that particular patch, or that particular patch. And that's extremely important. So one of the things I would also recommend, as a corollary, is that companies ought to hire ecologists, because it's extremely important to know the machinery of nature, on the basis of which we are surviving.
And that seems to me as important for the financial industry to have these sort of thinking as much as for I suppose the real economy as well. So I think that's a really important recommendation. We're approaching the end of this discussion, and I just wanted to ask you a question about the events taking place this year. So we've got a big convention on biodiversity conference taking place in China later in October, and we've got, of course, the COP26 climate summit taking place in Glasgow in November. What are your hopes for these events? What progress can be made at these events that might move us in the right direction?
I'd be the wrong person to ask that, because I've really my life has been so divorced from international conference of this kind, these discussions. So I wouldn't know what to hope for even. But nevertheless, the review has some prescriptions. It goes without saying. What I'd ideally like to see happen, whether it's reachable or not, is and in this particular case, it's unlikely. What I would really like to see happen is one of the findings has been this incredible assault of humanity on some of the global commons, the oceans, and the global public goods like the tropical rainforests. And we read about that every day. How much of the tropical rainforests are being cut down. I mean, that's really suicidal what we have. But at the moment, all we do is to moan about the latter and ignore the former. Moaning about the latter is not good enough, and we moan because it's under national jurisdiction, and there's nothing an outsider can do about it, right? Because the rainforests are geographically located in a few countries. But economics tells us that if the whole of humanity is benefited from their presence, then should we not compensate those who have the right to do what they like about it? That's straightforward economics, okay? So some negotiation needs to be conducted seriously. And of course, with all negotiation will be cantankerous and you name it and so forth, but that's not my business. The point is that we have to go that route. Otherwise, just sit and moan is not good enough. Or leave it to some philanthropist to pay. But we are looking at serious biomes. I mean, no single person can handle this. We are looking at big money. On the other hand, we have the global commons, like these are open access resources. The huge amount of transportation of goods and services take place across the Pacific, Atlantic, routinely. Who's paying any rent for that? Nobody. Nobody's charging because nobody owns the oceans. The fishermen don't have to do anything. They trawl like crazy, destroying some of the, and it's just doing enormous damage to the oceans because nobody owns the oceans. So what would economics tell you about a global public good like that? Without the oceans, we have sunk. We'll be absolutely dead. Not just the economies, but humanity will be wiped out if the oceans lose their fecundity. It would be that we charge rents for it. And who can do that? We have to authorize an institution to do that. So one of the recommendations, you can see where I'm heading, one of the key recommendations is that we ought now to be bold as we were after the Second World War and create an international institution like the World Bank and IMF that they did it after the Second World War to monitor and manage, perhaps charge, not perhaps. I mean, you can do it by either charging or banning. But you see, you can have safe zones, protected zones. You can enforce that. But then the problem arises, what happens to the unprotected zone? So you can have 30% of land and an agreement that they'll be protected. the problem arises what happens in the rest of the. And since they're all interconnected, if you destroy the other 70%, that 30% is going down the tube too, because everything is moving. Remember this mobile. So we do need something like that. And that can, in principle, can collect a huge amount of rents if we pay the fair price of transport across the oceans, or the fair price for fishing rights for it. Then that'll raise a huge amount of revenue, which could in turn pay for the subsidy of the protection of the rainforest, or the peatlands, or God knows what else. There's so much we can do to preserve nature, restore nature, preserve nature. They require money because it means investment there, standing off, and doing. And we haven't got the institutions for that. And that's not being discussed. So although it's a pipe dream on my part, that's what I would ideally like to see happen.
That's wonderful, and I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Professor Dasgupta, for joining us and for sharing not only some incredible thoughts but some really serious challenges. And I think we all need to absolutely get a grip of these challenges with a high degree of urgency. And I think some of the things you've shared with us today absolutely add a huge amount of color to that conversation. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you all for tuning in and listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. For some more very exciting interviews coming up soon, remember to like and subscribe and follow on all major platforms. And you can also find us on Twitter at UKSIF, all one word. We'll be back very soon. Thanks.